Lena Hart was only 15 when she did the unthinkable. Her mother, Diane Hart, had spent years trying to protect her daughter from the world, never realizing the real danger was growing inside her own home. On a quiet suburban night, love turned into something twisted, and a daughter's silence became deadly. When the police finally uncovered what happened, one image froze the nation: a teenage girl staring into a camera, her lips curling into an eerie smile. That haunting moment would make Lena Hart's name unforgettable. In the quiet neighborhood of Brookfield, where every house looked nearly identical and the streets were lined with trimmed hedges, the Hart family home stood out for its warmth. A small yellow house with flower boxers under each window and a welcome mat that read "Home Sweet Home." It gave off the impression of peace. To everyone on the street, the Harts were a picture-perfect family, even if that picture only included a mother and her teenage daughter. 15-year-old Lena Hart was known for her bright smile, good grades, and calm demeanor. Her mother, Diane, worked as a nurse at the local hospital, respected for her dedication and kindness. Neighbors often saw them laughing together on their front porch, sharing evening tea after Diana's long shifts. It looked like the kind of life every single mother dreamed of building for a child. But inside those same walls, the warmth was fading faster than anyone realized. Diane loved her daughter deeply, but struggled to balance being a parent and a protector. She believed strict rules would keep Lena safe, especially after her husband's sudden death 5 years earlier. Curfews were enforced, phones were monitored, and social media access was limited. Diane often checked Lena's messages, worried that the online world could expose her daughter to dangers she wasn't ready for. At first, Lena accepted it, understanding her mother's overprotectiveness as love. But as she grew older, her patience began to crack. Friends from school went to parties, stayed out late, and lived without the constant watch of a parent. Lena watched from her bedroom window, feeling trapped behind the walls of her supposedly perfect home. At school, Lena began changing in quiet but noticeable ways. She stopped joining after-school activities, often sitting alone at lunch, scrolling through her phone with a blank stare. Teachers noticed her once bright essays had turned into short, emotionless paragraphs. She no longer smiled during class or spoke to anyone unless necessary. Some thought she was simply going through the usual teenage rebellion. Others whispered that maybe she was struggling with grief she never truly processed. When a counselor tried to reach out, Lena dismissed it quickly, insisting she was fine. But the truth was, she had started to resent her mother with every rule, every lecture, and every question about where she was going. Diane's efforts to bring Lena closer only seemed to make things worse. She planned movie nights, cooked Lena's favorite meals, and even left small notes of encouragement in her school bag. Each attempt was met with cold silence. Diane often sat awake at night, staring at the family photos on the wall, wondering where she went wrong. She still remembered the little girl who used to wait at the window for her to come home from work, the one who would run into her arms as if she hadn't seen her in years. Now that little girl barely spoke to her. Sometimes, Diane told herself it was just a phase. Every teenager goes through rebellion, she thought. But, deep down, she knew something darker was happening. Lena had begun keeping secrets. She created hidden social media accounts that her mother didn't know about, using them to post photos of herself smiling in ways that looked more like a mask than joy. Online, she connected with strangers who told her what she wanted to hear: that she was misunderstood, that her mother was controlling her, that freedom was something she deserved to take. Those words began to shape her thinking, feeding the quiet anger she carried. Each argument with Diane added another layer of resentment, another reason to believe her life wasn't hers anymore. By early summer, tension filled the Hart household like invisible smoke. The sound of slammed doors replaced laughter. Meals were eaten in silence, the clinking of forks on plates louder than any conversation. Diane didn't see the warning signs anymore. She was too tired from work, too hopeful that things would eventually get better. Lena, however, had already made up her mind. The walls of that yellow house no longer felt like home, they felt like a prison. And in the stillness of her room, behind the glow of her secret phone screen, a plan was starting to form. A plan that no one in Brookfield could have imagined, coming from the quiet, polite 15-year-old girl next door. The night it happened began like any other. Diane returned home just before sunset, tired from a 14-hour shift at the hospital. She dropped her bag by the door, kicked off her shoes, and sighed as she looked around the quiet living room. The house was spotless, as usual, and Lena was in her room upstairs with the door closed. Diane called out a soft goodnight, receiving no response, but she didn't think much of it. Their conversations had grown shorter over the past few months, and silence had become a familiar sound between them. She changed into her worn-out pajamas, reheated leftovers from the fridge, and settled on the couch to watch an old movie she had seen dozens of times. The glow from the television flickered across her face as her eyelids began to grow heavy. Upstairs, Lena sat in her dark room, staring at the faint reflection of herself on her phone screen. The online messages that had once comforted her now echoed in her mind, "You're strong enough to take control. No one should own you." The words looped like a whisper she couldn't turn off. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her head, each thought colder than the last. There was no sudden outburst of rage or tears. Instead, she felt an eerie calm. On her desk sat a small kitchen knife she had taken earlier that evening, hidden beneath a stack of notebooks. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up, not from fear but from the weight of the decision she had already made. The house was completely still. The ticking of the clock downstairs was the only sound breaking the silence. Lena's footsteps were soft as she made her way down the hallway, pausing at the top of the stairs. From where she stood, she could see her mother asleep on the couch, her face peaceful, unaware of what was coming. The glow from the television made the room look almost dreamlike, colors washing gently over the furniture. For a brief second, Lena hesitated. Somewhere inside her, a small part of her wanted to turn back, to put the knife down and walk away. But then she remembered the long nights of being yelled at for sneaking out, the times her phone was taken, the loneliness she felt when her mother worked late. The anger returned, steady and cold. Otite, exactly las 10:47 de la noche. The camera in the corner of the living room installed by Diane months earlier after she noticed missing money captured Lena walking slowly into view. She stood behind the couch, silent, motionless, her shadow stretching across the floor. The scene lasted less than a minute, but it would later be analyzed frame by frame by investigators and reporters alike. Lena moved forward and disappeared briefly from the camera's frame. When she stepped back into view, her breathing was heavy, her hands shaking, and then she looked directly into the lens. The expression on her face was impossible to define, neither remorseful nor triumphant. Her eyes were blank, distant, as though she wasn't fully present in that moment. Then, slowly, her lips curved upward into a small, eerie smile. The footage froze there when detectives later paused it, capturing the image that would haunt the entire town. That smile spread across the internet, replayed on news broadcasts and true crime shows, symbolizing something people couldn't understand: a teenage girl who had just taken her mother's life and smiled as if nothing had happened. After it was over, Lena washed her hands at the kitchen sink, her movements mechanical, detached from reality. She wiped down the knife with a towel and placed it neatly beside the sink, as if cleaning up after dinner. She looked around the house one last time, noticing the framed photos on the wall, her childhood pictures, the family vacations, the birthday cakes. None of it stirred emotion in her. She walked to her mother's purse, took the cash from her wallet, and slipped out the front door without turning back. The street outside was silent, the warm summer air still and heavy. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and a car passed slowly down the road, its headlights sweeping across the house that now held a terrible secret. By the time the clock struck midnight, Lena was gone. The yellow house stood quiet, the television still flickering, the camera light blinking faintly in the corner. It would be hours before anyone realized what had happened inside. For now, the only witness to the crime was that small red recording lightened, the chilling smile of a 15-year-old girl, frozen forever in its lens. When the sun rose over Brookfield the next morning, the quiet street looked as peaceful as ever. Birds chirped, sprinklers hissed across lawns, and neighbors went about their routines unaware that something unspeakable had happened only hours earlier. It wasn't until late afternoon that the calm began to unravel. Diane's co-worker, who had expected her for a Saturday shift, grew worried when she didn't show up or answer her phone. Diane was never late. After several missed calls, the co-worker contacted the police to perform a welfare check at the Hart residence. Officer Daniels arrived first, knocking on the door several times before realizing it was slightly ajar. Inside, the house was unnervingly quiet, the air heavy and still. The television still played softly in the background, looping through old movie credits. As he stepped farther inside, the faint smell of iron hit him, and he knew something was wrong. Moments later, he found Diane's body on the living room floor. Her hands were folded unnaturally against her chest, her face pale and expressionless. It was a scene both tragic and hauntingly still. Lena was nowhere to be found. Detectives flooded the house within the hour. They began collecting evidence, snapping photographs, dusting for fingerprints. Nothing seemed disturbed except for the area around the couch and the kitchen sink, where traces of blood had been wiped away. On the kitchen counter, they found Diane's phone and purse, but her cash was missing. Upstairs, Lena's room was almost empty. Clothes were gone, her school backpack missing, and her phone charger left hanging from the socket. On the family's shared laptop, investigators made a discovery that would soon shift the case in a disturbing direction. Buried deep within the documents folder was a file titled Freedom Plan. Inside were journal entries spanning months, maybe even a year. They weren't random teenage thoughts, but careful notes, tracking every argument she had with her mother. Each entry described moments of anger and resentment, painting Diane not as a loving parent, but as a controlling force. "She watches everything I do." One line read, "I can't breathe in this house." The deeper detectives went, the more detailed the entries became, lists of ways Lena could take control of her life, ideas about running away, and unsettlingly brief mentions of a final step. Among these files, they also found something stranger. Screenshots of conversations with an online user named Seraphina. The tone of the messages was manipulative, disguised as comfort. "You deserve peace," one message read. "Sometimes, peace comes only when you let go of what's hurting you." Another said, "You're stronger than she wants you to believe. Freedom doesn't wait forever." The messages encouraged Lena to stand up for herself, but they grew increasingly darker, pushing her toward permanent solutions. Investigators traced the account's IP address to another state, but discovered it had been deleted just days before the murder. Whoever Seraphina was, she had vanished without a trace. News of Diane's death spread quickly through Brookfield. Neighbors who had once waved at Lena on her way to school stood outside the house in disbelief. Some left flowers by the mailbox, while others whispered theories about what could have driven such a quiet girl to do something so horrific. A few claimed they had noticed changes in Lena lately. How she stopped smiling, how her eyes looked distant, how she often wore the same hoodie pulled tightly around her face. Others remembered seeing Diane crying in a car after work, staring at her phone before wiping her tears away. Even in local news channels aired the breaking story. The headline read, "Brookfield teen missing. After mother found dead in home." Police described Lena as dangerous but also vulnerable, warning that she might be in shock or hiding nearby. They released her photo to the public, a school portrait of her smiling softly, unaware it would become the face of a nationwide search. Behind the scenes, detectives reviewed the home's security footage. They watched the blurry video in silence, each frame capturing what words couldn't describe. The moment Lena looked directly into the camera and smiled made one officer leave the room. Another, called it the most chilling thing he had ever seen. The evidence was overwhelming, but something still didn't fit. The messages from Seraphina hinted that someone might have guided her, someone who knew exactly how to manipulate a fragile mind. As the investigation deepened, the case shifted from a simple act of violence to a twisted story of control and deception. Who was Seraphina? Was she real, or a figment of Lena's unraveling mind? No one could answer. All they knew was that somewhere out there, a 15-year-old girl was on the run carrying the weight of what she had done, and the haunting smile that had already begun to terrify a nation. For nearly 2 weeks, the town of Brookfield lived in constant fear and curiosity. Every news channel, every online feed, and every whispered conversation in grocery store aisles revolved around one question: where was Lena Hart? Police received dozens of tips each day, but most led nowhere. People claimed to see her in bus stations, diners, and parks, but each report ended in disappointment. It was as if the 15-year-old had vanished completely. Behind the calm tone of official updates, investigators were growing desperate. The evidence pointed toward a runaway, but Lena had left behind no digital trail, no phone activity, and no contact with anyone she knew. She had disappeared with the same cold precision she displayed the night of the murder. Days turned into nights, and the media frenzy only intensified. Old classmates were interviewed on television, sharing stories of the quiet girl they once knew. Some described her as shy and polite, others as distant and unpredictable. One teacher remembered a time Lena had written an essay about freedom, describing it as a world without anyone telling you who to be. Her words, once dismissed as a teenager's fantasy, now seemed disturbingly prophetic. Meanwhile, police expanded the search radius, scanning nearby towns and bus terminals, while detectives continued digging into the mysterious online figure named Seraphina. The deleted account was traced through several VPNs, leaving investigators stuck in a digital maze. Whoever had been behind it knew how to disappear. It wasn't until a gas station clerk in a small town nearly 100 miles away recognized Lena's photo that the search finally broke open. He told police she had come in late at night, wearing a hoodie pulled over her head and paying for snacks in crumpled cash. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and she avoided looking at anyone. Surveillance footage confirmed it was Lena. Within hours, law enforcement from multiple counties coordinated to track her movements. She had been staying at a rundown motel under a false name, paying in cash and keeping to herself. When officers surrounded the motel and knocked on the door, there was no struggle, no attempt to flee. Lena opened the door slowly, hands raised, her expression unreadable. At the station, investigators expected emotion. They expected panic, tears, or denial. Instead, Lena sat silently in the cold interrogation room, staring at the table. Her calmness unsettled even the most seasoned detectives. When they played the footage from her home, showing the moment she looked into the camera and smiled, her expression didn't change. She didn't cry, didn't flinch, didn't look away. After several minutes of silence, she finally spoke, her voice steady and detached. "I finally got my peace," she said. Those 5 words sent chills through the room. It wasn't a confession born out of guilt, it sounded like relief. Psychologists were brought in to evaluate her, searching for answers that made sense. Some described her behavior as classic emotional detachment, a result of prolonged control and isolation. Others believed she had been manipulated, her young mind twisted by someone online who knew exactly what to say. One therapist noted that Lena displayed signs of dependency and disassociation, as if she had been living under someone else's influence. Still, no one could agree on how much of her decision was her own. When asked about Seraphina, Lena offered nothing. She simply stared blankly, as if the name meant nothing to her. News of her capture spread quickly. Cameras gathered outside the police station, and headlines once again flashed across screens: "Teen killer found. The smile returns." Photos of her being escorted by officers showed the same unnerving calm. There was no visible remorse, no fear, just that same faint, distant smile that had already become infamous. Experts debated her motives. News anchors speculated endlessly, and strangers online formed their own theories. Some saw her as a product of emotional abuse, others as a cold-blooded killer without empathy. That night, as the town finally exhaled, officers processed the reality that the case wasn't truly over. The mysterious figure behind the online messages remained missing, and no one could prove whether that person had been real or a projection of Lena's fractured state of mind. But one thing was certain: the girl who once lived in the yellow house on Maple Street had crossed a line she could never return from. She didn't resist arrest, didn't ask for a lawyer, and didn't ask for forgiveness. She only requested one thing before she was taken to the juvenile facility: to see the footage one last time. When they showed it to her, she watched in silence, her eyes fixed on the screen. As the final frame froze on her own chilling smile, she leaned back and whispered, barely audible, "It looks peaceful." The courtroom was silent as Lena Hart entered, dressed in a plain gray sweater and jeans, her wrists bound in cuffs that looked too heavy for someone her age. The gallery was packed reporters, curious locals, and even strangers who had traveled from other towns to witness the trial that had captured national attention. The quiet hum of cameras and the scratching of pens filled the air as everyone waited for the girl whose smile had become infamous. When Lena took her seat beside her attorney, she didn't look at anyone. Her face was calm, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. For a moment, it was easy to forget she was only 15. The prosecution presented a clear, chilling case. They showed the footage from the security camera, pausing on the moment Lena looked into the lens and smiled. The image filled the courtroom screen, freezing her expression in time. Gasps rippled through the audience. The prosecutor's voice cut through the silence, calling her smile the coldest thing he had ever seen. They painted Lena as calculated and emotionless, a teenager who meticulously planned the murder of her mother. They pointed to her journal entries, her online communications, and the careful way she covered her tracks. Every piece of evidence, they argued, showed intent. She didn't lose control. She knew exactly what she was doing. The defense countered with a different story. They described Lena as a child pushed to her limits, living under a strict parent whose love had turned suffocating. They argued that she was manipulated by someone online who preyed on her vulnerability, planting the idea of freedom until it became an obsession. A psychologist testified that Lena had developed a distorted sense of reality, her emotions numb from years of repression and loneliness. To the defense, she wasn't a monster. She was a victim of control and manipulation, both at home and online. Throughout the trial, Lena remained expressionless. She rarely looked up, never cried, and never spoke unless directly asked a question. When the judge asked if she understood the charges against her, she simply nodded. When her attorney asked if she felt remorse, she responded softly, "It doesn't change anything." Those 4 words unsettled everyone in the room. Even the jury couldn't tell whether they were hearing from a confused teenager or someone completely detached from the weight of her actions. The trial lasted weeks, each day peeling back another layer of Lena's life. Former teachers described her as gifted but withdrawn. A neighbor recalled seeing her mother cry through the kitchen window late at night. Psychologists debated whether Lena's sense of control had been warped by trauma or by something far darker. Despite the countless hours of testimony, one mystery remained unsolved: the identity of Seraphina. The account had vanished completely, leaving investigators with no trace of who had sent those messages. Some believed it was an adult manipulating her for entertainment or cruelty. Others theorized it could have been Lena herself, using a second identity to justify what she was planning. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom held its breath. The judge's voice was steady as he read it aloud. Guilty of second-degree murder. Because of her age, Lena was sentenced to 25 years in a juvenile correctional facility, with a review for parole after 15. The decision sparked debate across the country. Some said it was too harsh for a teenager. Others said it wasn't nearly enough for what she had done. As Lena was led away in handcuffs, Cameras flashed wildly. She turned her head slightly toward the crowd, and for a brief moment, her lips curved upward into that same faint smile, the one that had haunted every news report and headline since the night of the murder. It wasn't wide or exaggerated, just a quiet, chilling echo of the image that had started it all. Reporters shouted her name, asking why she did it, but she said nothing. Years later, the case would still be studied in psychology courses and true crime documentaries. The footage of Lena's smile became a lasting symbol of the story, played over and over in slow motion, analyzed by experts searching for meaning. Some claimed it showed defiance. Others said it was emptiness. A few even suggested it was the smile of someone who finally felt free. The yellow house on Maple Street was eventually sold, repainted, and remodeled. But locals swore the air around it still felt heavy, as if the walls remembered. Lena Hart's story became more than a crime. It became a question that no one could answer. What makes a 15-year-old kill the person who raised her? Was she born without empathy, or was she shaped by isolation and manipulation? The truth was buried somewhere between those two possibilities. And though time moved on, one image remained: a soft, haunting smile of a girl who destroyed everything and never once looked back.